Hi, this is Professor Charlie Evans, and this is my lecture on the Great War. Actually, this is my sixth or seventh attempt to get through this, so let me see how I can do this time. And bear with me while I take a moment here and get my notes together. The picture that you're looking at right now is a photo of Voisin American Cemetery, which is in France and which holds the graves of 6,012 American soldiers that died in this battle during World War One. All told, I think there's a little over 30,000 American soldiers buried in France and Belgium that were casualties of World War One. Total American deaths in World War One, I think, is a little over 115, 116,000, and so 30,000 remain in France. Um, a couple of really quick notes about World War One. Of course, it was the largest war up to that point in history. It was fought on an unprecedented scale and involved unprecedented casualties. We're going to turn our attention to the casualties in a minute, but consider that some of the battles in World War One were monumental in nature. They dragged on for months. Verdun in 1916, the Somme in 1916. These were battles that literally lasted months and that literally resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties. Unprecedented scope and scale of the damage inflicted on the soldiers of World War One. Of course, the war was called the Great War. It wasn't called the First World War until there was a Second World War. It was called the Great War. It's still called the Great War because of the enormous casualties that occurred in the war. Let me turn my attention right now to some of the results of the war, the impact of the war, because that's what's really important for the course is the long-ranging impact of the war. And the first thing I mentioned is economic impact of the war. The war destroyed the economies of the countries in Europe. France, Britain, Belgium, Germany suffered enormous physical damage in the war, and the victors ran up enormous governmental debts. This made the United States the most powerful economy in the world and shifted the power of the world economic base from London to the United States. That was a dramatic change as a result of World War One. Also mentioned the political impact of the war. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian empires ceased to exist. That meant a dramatic change in the world power relationship, and that meant a dramatic influx of new countries in the world. That was going to be very important. Okay, I'm back. I kind of lost my place there when the doorbell rang, but I talked a little bit about economic and political. I might also mention the social impact of the war, the fact that women in most of the belligerent countries were involved in war production. Women came out of the households and began working in factories and getting paid for their work, and that meant that women had a slightly increased political presence in some countries that didn't make much of a difference. I'd also mention the intellectual impact of the war, the fact that the Great War, that there were so many casualties, contributed to an, an, um, an intellectual dissatisfaction with the Western world, an intellectual critique of the Western world. It called into question the whole idea of progress. If if you looked at history and history was progress and the world was getting better and we're having all these advancements, and suddenly you slaughter all these millions of men on the battlefields of Europe, well, then what does that mean for progress? So let's turn to casualties, and you'll see that the belligerents in World War One mobilized over 65 million men for the war effort. And of those 65 million men, 27 million plus were casualties. 7.5 million were dead. Most of the POWs that are missing were also dead, so you could say that probably 10 million dead in the war. You see the United States mobilized quite a few men for the war effort, suffered relatively small casualties compared to the main countries of France, Germany, and England in the war. Now, I just want to look really quickly at the French statistics. You see that the French mobilized almost 8.5 million men, and of that 6 million were casualties. So that's roughly 3/4 of all the men that France mobilized for the war were casualties of war. And the numbers aren't shown here, but if we look more closely at the casualty figures, we'll see that of the entire generation, the entire population of French men from between the ages of 20 and 32, 1/2 died in World War I. That had an enormous impact on French society, an enormous impact on French economy, and an enormous impact on French politics. A whole generation of men died on the battlefields of France and Northern Europe, and so they weren't there to grow up and mature and take their rightful places in French society. And that caused an enormous crisis for France and was one of the contributing factors to the French desire for increased security vis-a-vis Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. The last thing I want to mention about the impact of World War I is that for communities throughout the United States, suddenly some of their young men were dead on the battlefields of Europe. And for example, in my small town, 5,000 people, rural Pennsylvania and everything, when that first soldier died and was returned to be buried in a cemetery in my hometown, that was an enormous event for the town. Suddenly, the residents of the town, the people of the town, were part of events that happened thousands of miles from where they lived and where they could now die and everything. And that caused a backlash in the United States, an enormous wave of isolationist sentiment swept the United States. The United States didn't really want to be involved in foreign conflicts, didn't really want to be involved in foreign policy, didn't want to really be involved in the rest of the world. And this would have enormous consequences when the politics and the political events of the 1930s began to play out. Okay, thank you.